Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, I wanted to check in with you all and give you a little sneak peek behind the curtain, because I am conscious very often I am head down just banging these interviews out every day. And I do get a few emails from you all asking what my process is. And it is currently mid-September as I record this episode today, and I already have 25 interviews edited and scheduled for release and 10 interviews booked in every week until November. It's a great problem to have, and I just wanted to take a step back and thank you all for making this podcast what it is. You tuning in every day is what brings this show to life. It would be nothing without you all, so I cannot thank you enough. And one of the biggest problems around being so busy is occasionally if I'm ill or family problems occur, or it can take a while to reschedule a show with a guest. And for that reason alone, I wanted to send a very special thank you to today's guest, Tony Marlow, for his patience. Despite it taking a little longer than usual to sit down with him to record this podcast today, he never once complained, threatened to toss a table in the air in anger, just patient and understanding throughout. So a big thank you to Tony. And at the end of it all, I found myself a new friend, a fellow beer enthusiast. But more on that story later, because there is a new frontier of digital advertising. The pandemic has transformed the advertising industry. There are also cookies, privacy and regulation, and so many hot topics around that. So I wanted to explore how we're moving beyond traditional ad verification and towards digital media quality, new ways of digital targeting, contextual, supply path optimization, programmatic, social. The list can go on, can't it? So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to New York so we can speak with Tony Marlow from a company called Integral Ad Science, who you probably know better as IAS, but enough from me. Let's get Tony onto the podcast now. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Thanks, Neil. Well, hi to everyone. My name is Tony Marlow, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Integral Ad Science, otherwise known in the industry as IAS. And if you're not familiar with us, we're a media quality company. We operate within that digital advertising space, and essentially we help advertisers as well as publishers and platforms to make every impression count. Now, that can mean helping marketers make a better connection with their intended audience by doing things like controlling the context of an ad, or controlling for factors like ad viewability or protecting against ad fraud. And it can also mean finding optimal programmatic supply path to those quality impressions that you're after. And it can also mean helping publishers optimize their yield. So in more simple terms, I like to think of us as the industry's GPS to find those optimal quality impressions that can actually make an impact with your audience, while also avoiding those ones that maybe won't or don't align with your objectives. And happy to, during the course of this discussion, talk a little bit more about any and all of that in more detail.
Yeah, thank you. And it's such an exciting space at the moment, especially with everything that's happening with the predicted end of the third-party cookie in a few years, the web getting more private, Apple's stance on what they're doing with Safari, and then with email marketing as well with iOS 15. So much to talk about. But before we do, I've got to ask, can you share your origin story? I mean, where did your passion for tech come from, and what put you on this path that you're on today? And how did the worlds of marketing and technology collide for you?
That's funny. Origin story. I like that a lot. It's like something out of a comic book. I guess I can 100% let you know that there were no lab accidents, no radioactive spiders in my backstory. And I guess when it comes to my career, most people ask me a lot about my time at Yahoo. I spent the better part of a decade there. And it's arguably one of the most interesting periods in that company's story through the 20-teens, as some call it. But I think of my career more in terms of the broader journey. And I actually, if the accent didn't tip you off, began my career out of Australia. I started with a small insights-oriented consultancy based out of Sydney in Australia. It was actually founded by a couple of former McKinsey folks. And we worked across a number of industries, but being my first job out of university, I was always most attracted to our technology projects. And to date myself a little bit, this was the very early days of digital media. So I mean the point in time where you would have companies like telcos and wireless companies trying to convince the world that having the internet on your mobile phone might be useful. So that is where I very first got my taste for digital. And I've not looked back. From that company, I joined Nielsen Net Ratings, which ultimately became Nielsen's online division. And essentially, it was their digital practice. I was still in that APAC region. And I worked with such a killer team there out of Sydney. In fact, we achieved so much. We together invented a brand new way to measure the impact of brand advertising online. And in a roundabout way, that's kind of how I ended up in the US. I was traveling to New York a lot, evangelizing this new product that the team had created, showcasing how it could drive consistency in the way brand impact could be measured globally for Nielsen. And I had a chance meeting with this guy who worked at Yahoo. We went and had coffee. And long story short, a few weeks later, after a couple of conversations with stakeholders at Yahoo, they had made an offer for me to move to New York, join their team, produce thought leadership research to help educate marketers how to leverage what was a fairly new digital medium at that time and best make connections with their audience. So I moved to New York, and really it was to really drive that thought leadership perspective. When I joined Yahoo, it was in that role. When I left Yahoo 8 or 9 years later, I was running the B2B marketing division, essentially the CMO of the B2B division. I didn't touch the consumer marketing, but when the message was to marketers to help understand how they could leverage Yahoo and the platform to make those better connections, that was my job. From there, I did a stint in the big data space, working at a company called DataAxle as CMO. And I'm currently, as mentioned at the top of the conversation, the Chief Marketing Officer at IAS. And the journey has been a fun one. I think it's also worth saying I've always been a marketing and advertising nerd. As someone who's now stateside, I'm now the guy who during the Super Bowl wants to watch that ad again, wants to talk about the ad, who doesn't necessarily even talk about the gameplay and the strategy behind it, and that's the thing that really fascinates me. I love marketing. I love digital, and I feel privileged that I get to marry those two things together in my everyday.
What a great story. When you were talking about there that one of your jobs early on was trying to convince people that the internet would be good on a phone. I don't know if it reminded me, I don't know if you've seen this. There's an old clip of the Letterman show where Bill Gates is on there trying to explain what the internet is and how everyone's going to be excited about it. And everyone just mocked and laughed at him. Have you seen that clip?
I know the one you're talking about. And relatively speaking, in such a short window of history, such a dramatic change has occurred. Like from the mid 90s to now, we've essentially created an entirely new medium with entirely new opportunities, ways for people to connect, ways for brands to connect with people. And it's interesting. The other one that sticks in mind that's similar to what you mentioned, there was a Katie Couric segment where they were trying to explain to each other what the internet was. No one had any idea. And yet, here we are, and it's such a mainstay in all of our lives.
And like you said, you've been on such an incredible journey now from Sydney to New York, and you're talking to me in Palm Beach today. But I'm curious, what do you miss most about home?
That is a loaded question.
Yeah.
For listeners for whom this means something, I deeply, deeply miss sausage rolls and meat pies. Great, British/Australian cuisine. Try it if you can, but I deeply miss that. It's hard to come across good ones here in the US.
Love that. And that path, of course, led you to Integral Ad Science, IAS, where you are exploring this new frontier of digital advertising. But can I you set the scene and tell me a little bit more about the kind of problems that you're solving, how you're doing it, and just for anyone that's hearing about you guys for the first time?
Yeah, and again, as I mentioned, we like to think of ourselves as a media quality company. So we operate within that digital advertising space, and we help advertisers and agencies as well as platforms and publishers to do what we call make every impression count. And so, as I was saying, this can mean things like understanding, was an ad viewable? Was an ad delivered to a real person as opposed to bot fraud? And was it delivered in the context that you desired? So is it turning up in a safe environment? Is it turning up in a suitable environment, given the values and objectives of your brand? And so that component is often, for those who aren't familiar, what's referred to as verification, when we're talking about is an ad viewable by a real person in a safe and suitable environment, and also did these things occur in the right geography? Those things are verification. But the thing that really makes us different is that we do go beyond verification, and we do go into this territory to help drive media quality and drive, more importantly, the outcomes off the back of media quality. So, for example, we also operate in the supply path optimization space, and we've got a solution that's called Total Visibility, which combines some of those media quality metrics that I just mentioned. Can you see the ad? Is it a real person? Is it in the right environment, in the right geo? So those media quality metrics with supply path costs. It's a one-of-a-kind product. I've not seen anything else out there even close to it. Certainly our competitors don't have anything like this. But what makes this so critical is having both of those things, both a measure of the media quality and understanding the cost, understanding the different paths to the same impression. What is the most efficient path to that impression essentially enables you to buy the best quality impressions for the lowest price. And I think you would know, just even having listened to your podcast, there's a really big difference between cheap media and efficient media. So cheap is not always best. Certainly if human eyes never lay eyes on it, great, it might be a cheap impression, but it's not doing anything. So we help you marry that with the cost. Let's let you get those highly effective, high quality impressions at the best quality price within programmatic environments. And so that's total visibility. That's one of these things that we consider going beyond traditional verification, but also with regard to proprietary platforms. So for example, with YouTube, we offer a service called Channel Science. This helps our clients do several things, but one of the big things is for them to help understand the context and, more importantly, optimize their campaigns based on the best outcomes that these different contexts are delivering, which is critical, especially within an environment like that where there's a lot of user-generated content, the veracity with which content is created, classifying this content accurately, quickly, in real time, and then creating actionable data to optimize campaigns against it is something that's pretty special. So when we say we're the only true media quality company that helps our clients drive outcomes, we do it in ways that we believe are cutting edge, and we do it in ways that we believe help the world go beyond traditional digital ad verification.
And it's interesting that this move that you're taking here away from traditional ad verification and towards this new digital media quality, because I think the world has changed so much in the last 2 years in every industry. And I would say that for most people now, they're not tuning into a TV set, a set time to watch a particular show. With Netflix, Apple TV, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, HBO, there's such a long list. And game consoles taking up our time over the last 2 years. We're consuming more and more video than ever before, but differently. So I'm curious, what are the challenges and opportunities with connected TVs now, and how are you helping there?
Yeah, the opportunity is massive. I'll just say one thing before I dive into the CTV question. Just for clarity, we're not necessarily moving away from digital ad verification. We're just making it such a bigger, clearer tapestry of metrics that can help drive media quality. I do believe verification continues to be a really critical part of the equation, but there's so much more than that. And in the context of your question, I think it's really smart to start with the consumer trends that you alluded to. So I think it's fair to say last year was an extraordinary year in many respects. Early on in the year, we declared a global pandemic. The pandemic changed behaviors in many, many ways, including media consumption behaviors. And this was for the better and for the worse. We saw in many Western countries, for example, some of the commute-related media really dipped off in the beginning. Things like radio, things like even podcasts took a temporary hit. There was a dramatic shift as people were following stay-at-home guidance. And at the same time, we saw a massive sudden increase in things like consumption of television, consumption of connected television in particular. And I think connected TV is one of the hottest stories that we have in the market right now. And so for us, when we look at the consumer behavior in the context of your question, what fascinates me is not just the growth in media consumption around CTV, but some of the specifics around it. And specifically, I mean, for marketers, it's not just a simple story of there are more eyeballs going to CTV. It's more complex than that. It's the interplay of subscription-supported CTV versus ad-supported CTV services. I'll just acknowledge there is a third model, sometimes called freemium, that's in between. But just for ease of conversation, let's just focus on the two. You've got one model, subscription, and I think everyone will be familiar, your Netflix, your Primes, Disney Plus of the world, where you essentially pay a monthly or annual subscription, you get your content, and there are no ads. And that's the subscription. Now, for a marketer, aside from product placement into actual content, there's not really an advertising opportunity against subscription. And so for a lot of marketers, what they're more focused on is what's happening in the ad-supported services. And what was really interesting, and during the height of the pandemic, we ran a couple of studies. We had Streaming Wars 1, Streaming Wars 2 to give a benchmark around what's happening in this streaming CTV space. And we observed what everyone knows, and that is that CTV consumption is growing. We know that 20% of CTV users added a paid subscription to their CTV service during coronavirus. However, what's not spoken about as much is more than twice that amount added a free ad-supported service over the last year. So what's interesting is if you look a little bit deeper, there's evidence to show that CTV users reached a point where they essentially said, look, I'm paying a few monthly fees here. The cost of this is adding up. And while I may have previously preferred for there to be no ads, I want more content. I'm consuming more media. I want to get it for free. And I'm willing to have this transaction where I get the content for free and I'm willing for there to be ads. And coronavirus was a pivot point for that to be a more accepted model within CTV. Obviously, that model has been in place for decades in traditional linear television. But last year was the point where CTV started to really go ad-supported, at least in major volume for the first time. And I think this has resulted in greater openness to that ad-supported model. And I heard there was one interview I saw with Jeff Green of Trade Desk last year, and he was talking about ad loads on linear TV. And he said, certainly he was referring to the US, but he said essentially ad loads made linear TV near unwatchable. Just the sheer volume of ads associated with the content meant people didn't want to lead into it. And he believed that one of the advantages and one of the reasons why people are really leaning into CTV is that you're going to get fewer ads matched to the content. And he believed that was one of the driving factors of adoption. And I think that makes sense as a part of the broader story. And so for me, when you talk about the opportunities, these eyeballs going not just to CTV, but increasingly to ad-supported CTV and the openness there, that creates a host of opportunity for marketers to make connections with their intended audience.
It's incredibly cool. And consumer shopping habits have also transformed over the past year. And like you said, we've not seen anything like it before. I'm curious, do you think it's going to continue this way? Is it going to continue to push changes forward? Or how do you see the future evolving in this space?
Yeah, that question is on point for this moment in time. Obviously, the coronavirus situation is fairly fluid. It's fairly different market to market. But what is clear is that over the past year, everyone has shifted towards an increasingly digital-first lifestyle. So we mentioned the media consumption, and that's a whole conversation in and of itself. But it's things like you were alluding to. So increased adoption of things like online shopping, especially within segments that may have been a little bit more resistant to this. So, for example, older demographics. Over the past 18 months or so, really forced, based off stay-at-home guidance, to find new ways to do shopping, find new ways to access food, whether it's grocery or restaurant, whether it's order in or food pickup. We're seeing swaths of society that hadn't necessarily leaned into these things start to adopt it. And then when we think about your question, and I think that this is the question is, okay, people change their behaviors. There was arguably this one-time event that was a driving force for people to do things differently in the form of the pandemic. But are these shifted behaviors permanent, or are they transient, or is it somewhere in between? And I could say here at IAS, we're blessed with a world-class research and insights team, and they ran one study called the Pandemic Effect, and essentially the results were really clear. 83% of people said that they intended to continue newly adopted behaviors such as online shopping or food delivery or food pickup or streaming they intended to continue this after the pandemic is over. Now, that's not to say people aren't looking forward to returning to physical activities. That the research was pretty clear on that. People want to go back to restaurants. They want to travel. They want to go to the movies. They want to go to the pub. And in fact, this week, I believe, in New York, Broadway reopened. People do look forward to going back to some of these, especially social things that are together and indoors. But what's interesting is that consumers also want to keep their increased digital behaviors while returning back to some semblance of the previous normal. 78% of the participants said that they feel comfortable returning to these types of things after restrictions ease. And what's also interesting is that they say that regardless of whether they're doing these things online or in person, that online ads form a really important part of the decision-making. So not only do the ads form an important part of the decision-making, consumers want these ads to be relevant to them. They want it to be relevant to the context, especially when it's shopping. And so an online ad can inform your shopping, whether that's clicks and mortar or bricks and mortar. People want that and they view it as an information source. So in a roundabout way, the pandemic has really increased the importance of getting the context right for your online ads. And I'll just say it again. Obviously, it's a fluid situation. Obviously, almost like a valve, we release the pressure and we tighten it up based off the data. But people are telling us, I both want to keep my changed behaviors, and boy, do I look forward to doing those things I used to love doing in person.
Absolutely. And yes, technology is in the spotlight right now. And I would say that we are arguably beyond the trend of just ensuring an article is positive, neutral, or negative for audiences. But can I ask that you expand on why it's now, whether that content makes us happy, sad, angry, and then using tech to pick up on those emotions to further direct the adverts? Because it's incredibly cool here, isn't it? The role of technology and how it's transforming this space.
Yeah, and I feel privileged. Our data science team is on the cutting edge of this. So I think a good place to start with your question is just an observation. I've noticed that publishers that build content and sell ad inventory against that content, they've traditionally been really good at building their content, and they've classified it in terms of broad buckets, things like sports or news or finance. But they've not necessarily gone deeper. And it makes sense, right? You're expert at producing world-class content, but classifying that content is a different beast. And so when you talk about marketers wanting to understand context and leveraging it to make a better connection, sometimes you need to go a little bit deeper than those traditional categories of endemic matching, such as sports, news, or finance. So when you talk about things like sentiment, that was a critical leap for the industry. So knowing an article was positive or negative in nature can help a marketer tailor their message. And a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that, for example, a negative sentiment content is bad. I don't want my ad there. That's absolutely not the case. So to think of it in this way, say there was some tragic news content, it might well be a real mismatch for your brand if your campaign is humorous in nature. That might just be a really inappropriate place for you to be cracking jokes with regard to your brand. But maybe a message of empathy works really well within that context. And just understanding the context helps you navigate, at least from a messaging perspective, a little bit better. And we've looked into this a lot, and this is an effect we call the congruence effect. So, for example, a car crash article is not necessarily a bad place for a car ad. And please hear me out. I really believe this. If your ad is about a turbocharger or the luxury leather seats, sure, like maybe that isn't a great placement for you. But what if your message is about safety and how you can help keep the family safe? It starts to become relevant to that moment. And I think the congruence of what your message is, given the context in which it's hitting your audience, matters so much more. And so then we come back to your question where you say, well, what's the impact of sentiment? What's the impact of going deeper than sentiment and understanding the emotions? And by that, we mean there are different flavors of positive or negative sentiment. So with negative, sadness is different to anger. And understanding with nuance what is the nature of the content can help you do a better job of making a connection with the person who's consuming it. And even more recently, we actually just over the past week released a piece of biometric research in partnership with a firm called Nuance. Essentially, we had around 60 people in New York wear some neurological technology on their head. we showed them a bunch of ads with different types of contextual matching. So there was a control group where there was no contextual matching of an ad to its content. We had an endemically matched scenario. So that means an auto ad with auto content. And we had a thematically matched scenario. So that means it's not necessarily the category of advertiser, but for example, one of the executions that we measured, it was a beverage company. It was a summer themed ad. And that when that ad turned up near summer content, seasonal summer content, there was a thematic match, even though a beverage company doesn't necessarily have anything endemically in common with summer by nature. It was the theme of the campaign. And while it's an immensely complex study, we essentially found when you get those endemic matches, we observed a 36% spike in the part of the brain that's responsible for practical and detailed memory. So that means if your message is something like a 50% off message, that practical detail has a greater chance of being remembered if you do an endemic match. And when we looked at the thematically matched scenario, we saw that the part of the brain responsible for more creative, what the scientists call global memory, but it's the more creative hemisphere of the brain. We saw thematically matched ads spike by 40% for that portion of the brain. So that essentially means if you're really trying to convey more of a deeper brand message, or maybe you're repositioning your brand and it's not such a tangible message, then maybe those thematically matched adjacencies work better. And so it starts to become really complex, but the upshot is the more you know about the context in which your ad is appearing and the more you can control for it, the better chance you have of making a meaningful connection. And it's not just theoretical. We actually ran this was out of APAC. We ran a series of case studies with an agency called Bench Media. And they essentially, across a couple of their clients, they ran an audience targeting segment within programmatic, some of the typical audiences that they would target for their brands. And they ran some of IAS's context control, which is our contextual targeting segments, and it was a head-to-head. And they found in the real world, contextual targeting versus the audience targeting they were using was 21% more effective in inspiring click-through. So the click-through rate drove up by 21%. There was a 23% improvement in CPM, so that goes to the cost. And there was a 36% improvement in cost per click. So when we talk about neuroscience and we talk about some of the studies we've done, I think a lot of people will say, well, that's great background, but what does it mean in the real world? In the real world, it means you're going to get greater engagement and generally could lead to more efficient purchasing of media just by understanding the context. So you're absolutely right when you say we can go beyond just sentiment, and understanding so many of these elements can help us do a better job in just doing what we do, and that is connecting with our audiences.
I completely agree with you there. Context and nuance is absolutely everything. It often gets lost now, so it's great to hear you saying that. And of course, a problem we've got to mention here is, especially in the advertising industry, is fraud, especially with so many bots everywhere. I mean, with fraud figures higher than ever, how are you finding brands leveraging technology to actually identify when a bot is viewing their ad? Because it is a huge, huge problem, isn't it?
Yeah, huge is the word. I recently saw a piece, I think it was out of Jupiter Research.
Yeah.
And they said that currently more than $42 billion are lost to ads just being served to bots for those that are left unchecked, that don't have protection and mitigation around it. And their forecast was that it's going to reach $100 billion loss. That's billion with a B, by 2023. So when you say huge, $100 billion lost on ads being served to bots rather than humans, huge is one of the only words that I can think of. And so basically, another way to think about this is if your campaign as a marketer, if your campaign does not have fraud protection, you are being stolen from. Your ads are being wasted and bots are seeing your ads, not real people. If you don't protect it, it's almost inevitable. You can't avoid it. The fraudsters are out there. It's a very lucrative business. And in fact, we work with many government agencies worldwide, including the FBI here in the US. It's really clear from the court cases that we've been a part of and some of the FBI cases that we've been a part of, the fraudsters really view it as low risk. You might be in some foreign country from the country where the ad is delivered. You might feel you're untouchable. You feel there's a lot of money to be made. We just talked about it being in the $100 billion range in the coming years. So these things combine to mean that it's just rampant. Ad fraud is rampant, and you need very effective protection techniques and technology in order to minimize the fraud that your campaign will experience. And at IAS, we believe we have essentially the most sophisticated and effective approach to doing this. In fact, we believe it's not even close. We think we're that far ahead of our competitors. And basically for us, while it is complex and I'm not in the threat lab and I'm not a data scientist, our basic position is it takes a bot to stop a bot. We have a threat lab, a team of scientists that essentially leverage machine learning and deep learning to create a self-learning AI that can update in real time, that can recognize in real time new threats. So the old way to do it, and some of our competitors still do it this way, is what's called deterministic. And essentially that means a human will make rules around what is defined as fraud and what is not. So this is a pattern we observe. This means it's fraud. But the problem is the fraudsters are actually using machine learning to perpetrate their fraud. The fraudsters are actually using dynamic means to perpetrate the fraud and appear like a human when they're not. And they really easily outsmart these old deterministic approaches. So if you're after a fraud solution that really works, you do need to do things like understand what are the environments in which fraud is rampant. So there are going to be some online destinations that are higher in fraud than others. You want to do things like understand, can I apply technology in a way that is superior to the technology that's being deployed by the fraudsters? Can I have a smart bot that outsmarts their bot? And that's essentially the game that we're in. We can do both of those things, both at that domain level and also at the technological level. And also saying that we can combine the smarts of our data scientists on that threat lab with the machine learning that they leverage to help detect and mitigate the effects of ad fraud. But going back to your word huge, the $100 billion number scares me, and I think it should scare marketers, because that is just pure wastage. Imagine if every single one of those impressions actually reached their intended audience, the difference it would make. It would be huge.
But of course, there is so much to be excited about at the moment. There's a lot of opportunity as well as challenges. So I've got to ask, what are you excited about in the future and that journey that you're on of going beyond verification to set the benchmark for trust and transparency, and also the role that IAS are going to play in that future too? Is there anything that particularly makes you want to jump out of bed in the morning?
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much. I think of almost like saving the whales. Part of me thinks of, saving the ads, the absolute best campaign on earth, the most compelling creative executions, those ones that everyone's talking about. It makes you laugh. It makes you feel something. They literally do nothing if they're never seen. They literally do nothing if they don't reach a human. And so I think the prospect of unleashing the potential of amazing creative, especially as a marketing nerd, that's something that really drives me. But a little forward-looking, I actually think we're on the precipice of a new wave within our industry when it comes to marketing. And I like to think of it as a movement called marketing by mindset. Actually, this was a term coined by a researcher at Yahoo called Edward Wong. He's a really smart guy. But this notion of marketing by mindset is something that I think is really critical to the next phase of success for marketers in connecting with their audiences. And so just to explain what I mean by marketing by mindset, I mean that you can hit the right audience with your ad, especially in digital environments where, you mentioned deprecation of cookies at the top of our conversation. That's going away. It's minimizing the effect of audience targeting. But marketers have really been leading into give me the audience. I want to connect them. But it didn't really acknowledge that you can hit them at the wrong moment. You can connect with someone who is the right person, but they're in the wrong mindset. So, for example, let's say I'm a beer enthusiast, and I actually use this example a little bit, but and by the way, I am. If you serve me an alcohol ad while I'm on LinkedIn, that may not be the right moment. I'm the right person, but you're just getting me in the wrong mindset. So doing this could actually be a form of wastage. But if that same campaign hits me while, say, I'm checking sports scores or my fantasy team, I'm in a different mindset. Maybe I'm checking restaurant content. The mindset that's associated with those activities might be more congenial to your message. And I believe that we're really just on the precipice of shifting into this notion that marketers are going to start marketing by mindset. Context actually becomes one of several windows into helping to understand what is a person's mindset in this given moment. And then marketers can do a better job of connecting, because not only do they understand who the person is, they understand with some sort of reasonable sense of who it is and what is their mindset in that moment. Are they in a professional mindset? Are they in a social mindset? Are they someone who's open to my message in this moment? And that idea that context gives us a window into mindset, and this unlocks the idea of marketing by mindset, is the thing that I think is the immediate future of us, particularly in a world where sooner or later cookies will be deprecated within the Chrome browser. In Europe and other parts of the world, we have pretty stringent privacy regulation in the form of GDPR. In the US, there's CCPA. Other markets are really driving into it. And we're also seeing the device level changes where things like IDFA and Apple's change of policy around IDFA, all of these things do essentially have one common effect, and that's to reduce the efficacy of audience targeting. So that, combined with the ability to understand that mindset is not universal, it depends on the context in which someone is at, means that I think we're going to see marketers lean into context more than ever before. And we're going to see marketing by mindset become the trendy buzzword over the next couple of years.
Love that. I love chatting with you today. And I feel we could go on and on about this. There's so many things that we've not talked about. So it'd be great to get you back on in the near future. But a question I always like to ask my guests is ask them about the soundtrack to their career. Now, we started yours. You began life in Sydney, took you to New York. I suspect there would have been a few noise-cancelling earphones along the way. So is there a particular song and story you can share with us of a song that's inspired you, and we'll add it to our Spotify playlist?
I am such an audiophile. I'm not sure I can limit it to one, but I like in the context of when we were actually physically taking the stage, I had two tunes that I would go to kind of help get me into the moment. One may not be super intuitive, but I have a version of Carmina Burana o Fortuna, the Carl Orff thing. I have a version by the London Symphony Orchestra. It's by far my favorite version. It's an intense piece, and I've never heard any audio anywhere that can come close to getting a person in the zone as that. So I listen to that. My other go-to for pre-stage engagements, I'm Australian. AC/DC Back in Black is hard to go past. But they're the two for really getting me in the mood. I know we're talking vastly different genres of music, but I love those two.
Man, vastly different, but they both work, and both inspirational tunes, man. Absolutely love it. Great choices. In fact, you got me on a good day. I'm going to add both of those to the playlist. But
fantastic.
Before I let you go, though, for anyone wanting to find out more information about IAS, contact your team, maybe connect with you on LinkedIn, etc., what's the best starting point?
Yeah, you can always reach us at integralads.com. We have a part of our site called The Insider. We post a lot of our thought leadership work there. So some of the research I mentioned today, you can find there. You can grab us on LinkedIn. Our handles are all integralads.com. So that's LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. You can catch us there. And then for me personally, I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn, and my handle is Tony Marlow. Two Tonys and a Marlow.
Brilliant. Well, I've loved chatting with you today. Yes, about the new frontier of digital advertising and learning more about how the pandemic has transformed the advertising industry. But more than anything, it's your human story from Sydney to New York and beyond. And it'd be great to stay in touch with you, get you back on next year and continue to follow these trends and see what's happening on the other side of iOS 15 and a few other things. But more than anything, just thanks for sharing it with me today.
Yeah, Neil, absolute pleasure. Just such a privilege to be able to chat with you and talk about so many amazing things. I hope we can come back and have a second conversation. But in the meantime, thank you for having me.
Wow, what a great guy. And as a fellow beer enthusiast, I will be adding him to the cool guys I want to share a beer with at a tech conference, whether that be on this side of the Atlantic or if I'm able to go to the US in the future again. But remember, I want to hear where you listen to this podcast. Share your stories, insights, and options, and opinions, or send me your questions. You can do all that by emailing me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn at Neil C. Hughes. My website is techblogwriter.co.uk. Keep those messages coming in. A big thank you for every one of you listening, and for Tony and his patience today and making the podcast happen. So hopefully you'll join me again tomorrow. But until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.